Well, welcome to Identification in Gifted and Talented Programs. Today I will be sharing with you specifically the Renzulli identification system and his three-ring conception of giftedness and other important factors to consider when identifying for a gifted population. So the first thing to consider is that there is a continuum of ideologies in gifted education. And just like politics, those diverge from the very conservative or traditional to the very liberal or emerging ideologies. So an example of this would be grouping students by ability in a conservative level to, on a liberal edge, grouping by interests, motivation, learning styles, and tasks. So for this, it doesn't mean that you have to prescribe to a certain point on this continuum. It's just one thing to keep in mind, and as you've sort of had a pulse on gifted education throughout time, you might have seen some of these different ideologies implemented in programs you've been familiar with. So this, I think, is one of my favorite slides that I present with, and I think that this slide is so important because having internal consistency in a gifted and talented program, I feel, is probably one of the most crucial criteria that a coordinator or teacher of the gifted can really put forth. And in order to ensure that you have this internal consistency, you really have to have a definition of giftedness. Now, here in the state of Maine, we have local definitions. So that means the definition that I use at RSU 22 might be different than what is used in Skowhegan at MSAD 54 or in Cape Elizabeth or up in Limestone. So it's somewhat of a double-edged sword to have local control and the ability to have local definitions, because that also means that just like that, my definition or the criteria can be different within Hamden to Skowhegan to Cape Elizabeth or Limestone. So there are pros and cons to this as well. And really, once you have this definition of giftedness, and I will go through Renzulli's definition of giftedness today, you really want that definition to drive the instruction. So are you identifying for academics? Are you identifying for visual and performing arts? Are you identifying for creative thinking? What does your program look like? And make sure that the identification you are doing directly impacts the type of programming. So you do not want to identify based on reading skills if the programming you're offering is a completely visual and performing arts-based type of programming. You just want to make sure that whatever your definition is matches the identification criteria, and the identification matches the programming. So you just want to make sure that this circle is never broken and always in harmony. So this is basically, in a very nice part, a graphic representation of the three-ring conception of giftedness. So over on the left-hand side, we have those three rings, which Renzulli includes to be above average ability, task commitment, and creativity. Now, what is a little misleading with this is that the circles are all the same size in this representation. But Renzulli really makes a point to let professionals know that the circles here do not have to be the same size. And in my experience, I have seen students with huge circles in above average ability, mediocre, like a relatively smaller circle in creativity, and then maybe their task commitment might just be a dot. Like, it could be there, but that's something that really has to be worked on and helped to improve. And this is pretty common for gifted students because they've oftentimes gone through school with a very easy expectation. There hasn't been a lot of demand on them, and they haven't been able to develop that task commitment. I feel like in order to build resiliency, we have to have obstacles that show us how to deal with roadblocks. So Renzulli has this three-ring conception, overlaid on houndstooth. And he put the houndstooth there to represent all of these other specific performance areas sort of being in the background. That those three components of above average ability, task commitment, creativity are found when students maybe have a huge interest in puppetry. And when they are doing puppetry, there is this huge creativity. They are wise beyond their years. They've read puppetry books. They've watched YouTube videos. They've made their own puppet shows. They've written scripts. Like they just have this knowledge that is much greater than their peers. And as far as task commitment, they demonstrate the ability to work through obstacles, to figure out how to make a shadow puppet without instruction. They are determined to persist in that given performance area. So then it's always very important to remember that when we are identifying, there are going to be criteria that we cannot test. Task commitment is one of those. It's not on this slide necessarily, but that's a very hard thing to get a quantitative score for. Just like it's very difficult to test optimism or empathy or courage or moral conviction. And so when we are, depending on what you're looking for in your program, it's important to understand that there might not be a test to capture that. So you need to think about how you are going to identify your students. So factors that influence gifted behavior. Oh, sorry, I hate transitions. Let's get them all up. I feel like we should have background music. There we go. So factors that influence gifted behavior. So there's obviously personality factors, and we see this in a lot of our gifted students, but then there's also environmental factors that students have zero control over. And we want to make sure that when we are identifying or testing gifted behavior, that we are really testing something that is not an extra in life. So if your parents there's been research done about parents with certain education, say so many words, have a vocabulary that is much obviously broader than that of a person who might have needed to drop out of school or different things like that, or even the social economical status. That can always play a role. So we want to make sure that we are differentiating between personality factors, environmental factors, and making sure that the assessments we're choosing are really being a testable criteria. So a little bit more on the three-ring conception of giftedness. So like I said, so there's 3 circles. We're going to focus a little bit on the above average ability. Now, these are somewhat of the characteristics that you might look for. And there are tools out there that can help you with above average ability, obviously. We see this in achievement scores like the NWEA that our students take, the MEA that our students will be taking, or any other type of assessments that really mark learned achievement in the classroom. The DRA, all of these things are assessments that are given in the classroom that show where a student falls given a normed population. So we just want to think about these general abilities and look at the high levels of ability that they have in different criteria. And then there's also specific ability. So what is the capacity that the student has to determine the relevance of information or how to acquire information? So a student might be very good at decoding, but are they able to actually take a book and talk about the trends that are happening in, with the character's life? So there's a difference there of just word calling and actually being able to use this advanced knowledge and put it into work. Then there is the task commitment aspect that I spoke to. And, I've seen students with, I have to say, I've probably seen the most variance in this one characteristic in my years of in gifted education. And I feel like this is because the endurance or determination or resilience that students have been exposed to varies so much. So the task commitment comes with high levels of interest, enthusiasm, involvement. They show a persistence, that resilience to really follow through on a task. There's a self-confidence or a self-efficacy, as we like to say in the field, that they believe that they can achieve. And they have the ability to identify problems, but also within that ability to identify problems, they don't view the problems as an obstacle. They say, okay, I have X number of days and I need to, so there's a deadline approaching. That is my problem. Okay, I need to sort of make a timeline of what I need to do every day. So they're able to use these obstacles to view what they need to do and how to reach that goal. And they set high standards. They're open to criticism. This is something that I feel is a huge, not indicator, but something that a lot of the students I work with, especially now, are not open to criticism. The moment they hear that they didn't do something well, they sort of like their task commitment crumbles and they don't know what to do. So, and then there's the creativity part, just like task commitment. I feel like sometimes creativity can be a little elusive. There are certain assessments out there. The Torrance test for creativity is one that just pops into mind that can measure creativity, but it's a very involved assessment that does take a lot of time to score. So when we're thinking about creativity, Renzulli sort of breaks this down as fluency and flexibility, originality of thought, and being open to experience, being curious, mentally playful. I love that expression. I think that really gives you a nice mental image. Sensitive to detail, willing to act on and react to external stimulation, and own certain ideas and feelings. So, and Renzulli also speaks about how in the United States we come up with great ideas, but we don't have that follow through that other countries do. So his real goal is to have creative producers. You'll see that term a lot if you read any of his research of creative producers, of that being a mark of sort of coming through on the other side of gifted education. So also we need to keep in mind that just like in our regular classrooms, there is a huge variance of a gifted learner as well, and that there are learning differences in the gifted. And this can come through a multitude of ways that are all listed there. So aptitude and ability, achievement, academic background, cultural, maybe they're English language learner, their affect. Sometimes we see this in twice exceptional students. And then effort versus ability, and sometimes there's a huge discrepancy between those two. Perhaps the learning style, their interests. I know that when I have units going on, I have some students that are so interested in it, and then others that I call them my reserves. They'll show interest some days and then not, and it sort of is like this ebb and flow. And also self-regulation is a huge part of learning differences in students. And again, it goes back to that task commitment aspect. So when you are thinking about your definition of giftedness, it's really important that you work this through. So you want to have a way that you define giftedness, and this should provide rationale for whatever identification process and the assessment tools that you use in your program. You want the relationship between your identification process and assessments to really demonstrate how you identify your students. So the example that is given here is if a program is based on performance in accelerated mathematics, then it makes sense to use a mathematics aptitude test and math grades as part of your identification process. So it's really important that educators are vigilant to ensuring that there's also a diversity of students that are identified in gifted programs, and whatever percentage is identified in a gifted program should reflect the diversity of the total school population. So if a school population is made up of 10% Latino, I have to get my percentages right here, 70% Caucasian, and 20% African American, you want to make sure that your your gifted programs is also 10% Latino, 20% African American, and 70% Caucasian. So you just want to make sure that the identification tools that you are using also correctly identify within your population of students. And your identification should also create an awareness of a population for students whose exceptional abilities require services. And I've really had to do a lot of professional development for teachers on the difference between a bright student and a gifted student. And I feel like that is part of the identification process, is being able to talk about these characteristics and what an educational program looks like for a bright student and a gifted student. And then again, I feel like we've probably hit this home enough, but really make sure that services that are established match your definition of the program, as well as the identification process. So with the development of gifts and talents, we often see that students, just like growing a flower, which this would not be in my backyard, I have a black thumb, to be changed, though I need to change my mindset on that. So giftedness can be manifest. So it means that a student just, their gifts and talents have not emerged yet. They haven't had the exposure, the prodding, the nurturing to really allow gifts and talents to grow. We see the emergent ability in students that have had the ability to foster something that they are very good at, or had the time to really play with their passions or interest areas. I'm sorry, I went the opposite way. Latent is when something is sort of below the roots. I started at the bottom and went up. So we have latent, when students have not had that time, to emergent, to manifest, where these are students that in all of their glory are very confident, have had exposure, might have attended summer camps, are part of a GT program, and really are confident in what they can do, and take academic risks. So with Renzulli, so the identification of students has basically different ways that you could go through this, and you've seen that in the reading that you did this week. There's traditional, sort of that 4-stage process of sort of, if you think about that internal consistency, the talent pool model, which I will go into later in this PowerPoint, and then also a matrix. So the steps, the 4 steps of these, of the traditional, is nomination, screening, information gathering, and then final selection. So if you use this pathway, you want to make sure, like, who can nominate? Can parents nominate? Can students self-nominate? Can peers nominate? And obviously teachers will nominate. What does your screening process look like? What existent data are you collecting? Do you pull NUIA scores, MEA scores? Do you ask for report cards, attendance? What is it that is crucial to your program? And then sort of step 2 goes into step 3 of really gathering all of that information. And then step 4 is that final selection, which I have to say is never the best part of being in the gifted and talented arena, because you do have to sort of see the forest through the trees, or the trees through the forest, and really be able to think that you are, for this certain population, you need to identify a certain population because they need extra services. They need additional support in order to, all students deserve a year's growth in school. That doesn't matter if you're in 4th grade and you're on a 7th grade learning level. All students deserve a year's growth. And so really what I've always done is, you never want to be the only person who makes a decision. So really it's great to create a committee or an advisory board of teachers, administrators, guidance counselors to sort of help you sit and look at the data. I have worked on committees that have done this blind. I probably say 90% of the committees I work at look at student data blindly, so they take away any identifying information, name, really it would be name, I guess any other criteria depending on how small your district is, and just try and look at scores. So there's not any bias in that. And then I've also been in circumstances where names are there, and again, that's probably 10% of the time, and it does have a different It does have a different process because, you know, people will say, oh, I love this kid, or he's so great in class. And, you know, but that's not part of the screening process. So, I mean, it creates another layer. But if that is how you would like to look at it with your committee, you just need to make sure that that's how you've proposed it and just be consistent. So if you blindly select for some schools in a district, you need to blindly select for all, or vice versa. Identification instruments for gifted and talented students. There are checklists. There are nomination checklists that teachers can provide. Product information, obviously there's tests, the COGAT, the WISC, there's so many, the OLSAT, there's tons of aptitude tests. Achievement are those school-based tests, so the NWEA, the MEA, the DRA, those are all achievement levels. Perhaps you want to have a portfolio. You could also look at grades. Then there's step 6, evidence of high potential in alternate ways. And is there a parent in self-nomination? Now, this does not mean you need to have all of these. These are just things that you could put in place. I would probably think all of them might be a little bit too much. So the Renzulli identification system is based on that 3-ring conception, as well as the school-wide enrichment model, which I know at this point in the course we haven't really explored too much, but that shouldn't impact us learning about their identification system. It strives for equity, excellence, and economy, and that it can be done quickly and effectively with large schools. Now, I worked in Hartford, Connecticut, where we had 20,000 students in the district, and we used the Renzulli identification system for that district. It is designed to be flexible, so the way that I used it in Hartford, Connecticut might be different than how we use it in Hamden, Maine, and vice versa. And it is based on research of the behavioral characteristics of highly creative and productive people. So the goals are to develop creativity and task commitment, to provide learning experiences, to provide opportunities. And this is the identification system. So step 1, you get probably about, so you get about 50% of your talent pool, so to speak, from step 1, and that is test scores. So I would pull up the NWEA, for instance, the NWEA, and I would look at students who scored perhaps in the 92nd to the 99th percentile. In different districts I've worked in, it has been a different level of standard. Where I work currently, we only look at students who score 95% and above for our talent pool with step 1, but that could be very different given your student population. Step 2, you look for teacher nominations. And then step 3, there's alternative pathways, and sometimes this comes through with, like an ELL student or someone who might not have hit the test scores because they're just not a good test taker. Special nominations sometimes come through an IEP, where a student who might be on the spectrum or have another disability also is showing signs of giftedness, which is very common. We call this twice exceptional. And then step 5 is after you have made your selection, you notify parents, and then you have action information. We call them individualized learning plans now, but this can sort of take you through the process of how you would identify students. So these alternative pathways may include peer, parent, and self-nominations, creativity assessments, product evaluations, other measures, and this allows for those non-traditional students to receive gifted services if they so qualify. And again, I'm just coming back to the slide to just remind us that we really want to make sure that we are paying attention to our program's internal consistency. So always coming back to the definition of giftedness and making sure that that matches your identification and making sure that what you're identifying matches the programming. You want to make sure that those last two, identification and programming, have to be hand in hand. You really want to make sure that you're identifying for your program. So when you are identifying, there are two different types of action. So there's There's two different types of information. There's status information, and this is anything that you can put down on paper. that would tell you about the student. And then action information are things that you can only document when they are happening or after they happen. So status information are grades, test scores, student work samples, surveys, teacher input, parent input, self-nomination, peer nomination. Whereas action information are teacher observations of work habits, thinking, questioning, all of those. Different conversations. Perhaps you choose to do interviews or have students submit recordings. Those are all action information. So just to sort of recap, when you're identifying a talent pool students, you want to have a local decision for criteria. Use multiple criteria. Never just have one indicator. So don't just use the NWEA or just use the COGAT. Using both of those, and it's always good to have 3. You want to have multiple measures. Perhaps also putting in a teacher nomination. And then look beyond the obvious. Look for potential as well as talent. Because a lot of students might not have had that exposure. They might still be latent in really being able to be forthcoming with their gifts and talents. When you determine the size of your talent pool, here in Maine, we're told 3 to 5%. So I feel like that's a little bit more of a given. In other states and districts I've worked in, we've had the freedom to determine what percentage of the student population should be exposed to, our GT programming. When I was in Hartford, I looked at the top 30% instead of just the 3 to 5%. And so again, very different programming as well. These are just some of the examples of additional criteria. So this is a Renzulli identification system information summary form. So it has all of these different things. So maybe verbal tests like COGAT, the date. The COGAT has a verbal, we say quantitative instead of numerical, nonverbal. Then end of year grades, teacher rating scales, alternative pathways. So this is something that you could create for your identification program. Then there's also the scale for rating the behavioral characteristics of superior students. And if you Google this, you'll find a lot of different options. It has been digitized over the past few years to have an online component. I've also done this just in Google Forms because I work in districts that don't have a ton of money. That just takes a little bit of time, and mine doesn't look nearly as nice as what's shown on the screen, but it still does the same thing. So there are lots of examples online. I'll also include one in our module. So, but this is really what it comes down to, is you want to make sure that you are providing programming for kids to be able to come alive and really be able to have these moments where they feel lit up inside. And that's really what providing proper services is all about. So that is a brief summary of the Renzulli identification system, 3-ring conception of giftedness, and other tidbits about identification.